In representing myself in divorce court, my ex-husband's attorney smirked Chicaniford counsel. The judge flipped to page 9 of my filing and removed her glasses. Counselor, do you know what she did for 11 years? His attorney's pen hit the floor. The pen was still rolling when I decided not to pick it up for her. I'd spent 11 years making other people's messes disappear, straightening the crooked, smoothing the sharp edges, filing the thing that couldn't legally not exist, and I was done doing it for free. The hearing was at 9. I was up at 4:45, which wasn't unusual. I'd been up at 4:45 for most of the past decade because Caleb had colic the first year and then just never stopped being an early riser, and your body learns a schedule, and then it keeps a schedule even after the reason for it is gone. So I was up, and I made coffee the way I always make coffee. Same grounds, same water line on the pot, same 4-minute steep before I pushed the plunger down. French press. Marcus thought it tasted like the bottom of a river, but he drank it every morning for 11 years anyway, which tells you something about Marcus. I don't know exactly what, but something. I stood at the counter while it steeped, and I didn't think about anything in particular. That might sound like I was being calm and composed and strategic, but I really wasn't. There was just nothing left to think about. The filing was already in the folder. The folder was already in the bag. The gray canvas tote I've had since before Caleb was born, the one with the broken inside zipper that I've been meaning to replace. The tabs were all flat, the appendices were in order, the notary stamps were on the pages they'd been on since I put them there. I had checked everything 3 times, not because I was nervous, but because 3 times is what I do. It's what I've always done. My mother calls it my checking thing. She doesn't mean it as a compliment exactly, but she doesn't mean it as an insult either. She just means that I am a person who will go back and verify, who will reread the paragraph she already read, who will count the items in the bag against the list she made of the items, even when she remembers packing all of them. She used to worry it meant something was wrong with me. I think it just meant I was going to be very good at a certain kind of work, and then I didn't do that work for a while, and then I did it again, except this time for myself. The coffee was ready. I pressed it, poured it, stood there in the kitchen in the dark. It was November and the sun was not making any early efforts, and I looked out at the backyard. The oak tree at the back fence is losing its leaves late this year. A few of them were still hanging on. I remembered thinking that was something the kids would want to rake up before the ground froze, and then I remembered that the kids are 15 and 17 now, and neither of them has raked leaves, without being asked at least 4 times since approximately 2019. Old reflex. You tell the muscle something for long enough and it just keeps firing. I finished the coffee standing up. I rinsed the mug and put it in the drying rack, because I do not use the dishwasher for mugs, I never have. Something about the heat making the glaze go strange eventually. Marcus thought that was irrational. Marcus thought a lot of things I did were irrational. We had 11 years of evidence on that particular question, and at some point, toward the end, I stopped arguing about it and started writing things down instead. I got dressed. I wore the gray blazer over the blue shirt, the one combination in my closet that registers as professional without registering as trying. I stood in front of the mirror for a minute, and I did not give myself any kind of speech. I just looked at myself the way you look at the work before you hand it in. Checked for loose threads. Found none. Good enough. The bag was by the front door. The folder was inside the bag. The folder had 7 tab sections and an appendix that ran to 32 pages single-spaced with footnotes. Footnotes. I remember when I first learned to format footnotes properly, sitting in a classroom at Dunmore County Community College, 19 years old, in a class called Legal Document Preparation that met on Tuesday and Thursday evenings and smelled like industrial carpet cleaner and someone's microwaved. Lunch. I got an A-. I was annoyed about the minus for longer than I should have been. I locked the front door and stood on the porch for a moment. The neighborhood was quiet. It was 5:47 by the clock on my phone. The Warfield's dog across the street was watching me from their front window, the way he always does, that flat-faced beagle mix who seems personally offended by my comings and goings. The light was on in Dottie's front room. Dottie Polymus, across the street. She's been up at 5 every morning since before I moved into this neighborhood, and I know this because I have seen her light on at 5 in the morning for 8 years running. I thought about going over there and asking if she wanted me to grab her something from the courthouse cafeteria, She drinks that terrible vending machine hot chocolate. She knows it's terrible. She drinks it anyway. But it was too early and I didn't want to knock on anyone's door before 6. She knew where I was going. I told her when I brought the last batch of pages over for the final notarization in September, standing in her kitchen while she found her stamp. She looked at the stack of pages and she said, "Gwen, you were thorough." Just like that. Not surprised, exactly. Just noting it. Dottie has a way of saying things that is very precise. Comes from the work, I suppose. She was Dunmore County's deputy clerk for 21 years. Retired in 2016. Has a notary stamp and a commission that's current through 2027, and is, for the record, a perfectly legitimate notary public in the state of Pennsylvania. I just want to be clear about that. I got in the minivan. Started the engine. Let the heat run. Didn't leave yet. I sat there with the warm air coming out of the vents and the radio on low. Some morning show, I wasn't listening. They were talking about holiday sales at some point, and then traffic on the 78, and I thought about the Hendersons' dinner party. This was 4 years ago, maybe 4.5. Marcus had invited them over without telling me until the Wednesday before, and I had made the roast chicken and the potato thing and the green beans with the shallots and the lemon. And I had cleaned the dining room and dug out the good napkins that are cloth and have to be ironed. The Hendersons, Reg and Pamela Henderson, who Marcus knew from his firm, were perfectly fine people. They brought wine and complimented the chicken. Perfectly fine. At some point during dinner, Reg asked Marcus something about a project he'd been working on, and Marcus explained it, and then Reg asked something like, "Did you have someone helping you keep track of all that correspondence?" And Marcus gestured at me across the table and said, "Just Gwen. She's basically my assistant." And the table laughed. Pamela laughed. Reg laughed. Marcus laughed. I smiled, because it was easier to smile. I passed the wine. We moved on to something else. I sat in the driveway in the running minivan, and I thought about that. I didn't feel anything in particular about it. It was a memory. It was a memory I had looked at enough times that it had gone smooth, like a stone you keep in your pocket. What I will say, and this is not me editorializing, this is just the most accurate possible description of what Marcus said that night. He was right. I was his assistant. I was his assistant in the most literal, functional sense of the word. I drafted his correspondence when he dictated to me, which he did when he had too many emails and not enough patience. I maintained his filing system, paper and digital, for anything that crossed our shared accounts. I tracked every material purchase over $500 in a household where one partner was a partner at a regional law firm and the other was not, because someone had to and no one was going to do it for me. I kept records. I kept very careful records. I kept the kind of records I had been trained to keep in a Tuesday-Thursday evening class at Dunmore County Community College in 2001, and then in a job I held for 3 years before I met Marcus, and then through 2 pregnancies and 2 children and 11 years of a marriage that ended in a text message, which I also printed and filed. Under tab C. It was getting towards 6:15. I needed to leave by 8 at the latest to account for parking. I had time. I sat there a little longer. Here's what I did not do in those 11 years. I did not have a dramatic moment where I decided to start keeping records. I did not sit down one day with a ledger and a pen and say to myself, I am going to document everything, because someday I will need it. It wasn't like that. It was more like, this is just how I am. This is how I have always moved through the world. I note things. I write them down. I keep the notes. When the kids were small and I had very little time that was my own, I did it in the margins of their school newsletters and on the backs of grocery lists, and then later in a dedicated notebook, and then later in a consistent format that, if I am being precise, closely resembles the kind of time and services log that a paralegal would keep for billing purposes, because I had spent 3 years doing exactly that, and the habit did not leave me just because the job did. I let the certification lapse. This is something I have thought about. I was pregnant with Caleb, and it was up for renewal, and the renewal required a continuing education course and a fee, and at the time Marcus and I had agreed that his salary was sufficient, and I was going to focus on the kids, which I did, which I was glad to do. I don't regret it exactly. I let it lapse, the way you let a gym membership lapse when you move. You know you could get a new one eventually, you just haven't gotten around to it, And then time passes, and the thing itself starts to feel like a detail from someone else's life, something that belonged to the version of you. That existed before children, before the mortgage, before you stopped being a professional person and became a household person instead, which is a different category in the eyes of a lot of people and the same category in the eyes of the law, provided you can prove what you did. I could prove what I did. I had 32 pages of appendices and 11 years of monthly entries and 12 annual notarizations from a retired deputy clerk across the street, and if Blair Chetworth Nance had read past page 4 of my filing, she would have known that in advance. She hadn't read past page 4. I was fairly sure of that. I backed out of the driveway at 6:18 and drove toward the courthouse. The Dunmore County Courthouse has a parking garage attached to it that charges $8 a day, which is reasonable, and which fills up fast on hearing days. I got level 2 because level 1 was already full, which meant I had to take the elevator, which meant I was standing near the elevator on level 2 when Marcus and Blair Chetworth Nance pulled in. He was driving his car, the black one, the lease he renewed in August without mentioning it to me, which I mention only because the lease terms are in Exhibit 4. They parked 2 rows over. I watched from inside my car. Blair Chetworth Nance is tall. I knew this from the one time we'd been in the same room before, at the initial mediation that went nowhere, but I had forgotten it. She's maybe 6 feet, and she has that particular kind of composed posture that comes either from good breeding or from years of standing in front of judges. And in her case, it might be both. She had on a charcoal suit, the jacket nipped at the waist, and she was rolling a briefcase behind her on the textured concrete. Marcus was in the Navy, the good Navy, the suit he saves for things that matter to him. He looked good. He always looked good. I know what he looks like, and I know what that suit means to him, and neither of those things is relevant to anything, which is why I noticed them and put them down, and kept moving. They walked to the elevator without looking around, that practiced ease of someone who has never once seriously considered that a thing might not go the way they'd planned. I am not saying this meanly. I am saying it as an observation. Blair Chetworth Nance has won a lot of divorce proceedings, I assume, because she is competent and experienced, and the people she goes up against are usually tired and underfunded, and represented by whoever they could afford on short notice. I was not represented by anyone. I was representing myself. She had taken this in during mediation, and had written something on her pad that I could not read from across the table, but which I imagine translated roughly to, "Easy." I waited until the elevator doors closed. Then I got out of the car, took the bag from the passenger seat, felt the weight of it, the folder, the legal pad I always bring, a second pen in the front pocket, because I am not someone who goes anywhere with only one pen, and I walked to the elevator and pressed the button and waited. Checked the tabs through the canvas. All flat. Fine. The hallway outside courtroom 4B has benches that look like they were built in 1953 and last reupholstered sometime before the first Gulf War. I sat on the one closest to the water fountain, which is where I had sat at the initial motions hearing in July, and where I had also sat when I came to file the response in September, and there is something to be said for sitting in the same place, in the same room, with the same folder, the way A. Person who keeps careful records keeps careful records, not because any individual record is dramatic, but because the accumulation of them is something else entirely. A clerk I didn't recognize came through and nodded at me. I nodded back. She had a stack of manila folders under one arm and was carrying a coffee that smelled significantly better than courthouse coffee usually does, which made me think she'd brought it from outside, which I admired. Small mercies. I thought about Dottie. I wished I had brought her something this morning, that terrible hot chocolate she likes, or at least knocked on her door. She had come to my kitchen twice, and to her kitchen 3 times, and once she had come to the minivan because I couldn't move the kids' soccer equipment out of the front seat fast enough, and she had never once made any of it feel like a favor. She brought her stamp and her commission card and her little logbook where she noted everything she notarized, which is what a notary does. They keep a logbook. And she noted mine every year, same November, give or take a week, same description, domestic services ledger, pages 1. Thurant Toral. Affirmed by signatory under oath. She said once, the 3rd year, that most of what people brought her to notarize was wills and property deeds, and occasionally a very complicated power of attorney. She said my ledger was the most interesting thing she'd stamped in years. I wasn't sure if that was a compliment. I said thank you anyway. 11 notarizations. Not 12. I corrected myself when I wrote the cover page. It was 11 annual notarizations, because I hadn't started the ledger until Caleb was almost a year old, so the first year is missing, which I noted in the cover page's second footnote for accuracy. Because that is the kind of person I am. I flagged the gaps. The cover page also notes the lapsed certification and explains what it was and when it lapsed, and what it would have been current through had I renewed it. I put that in not for sympathy. I put it in because it's contextually relevant, and because any document I prepare is going to be complete, or it is going to be revised until it is complete. I was still on the bench when the courtroom doors opened, and the clerk with the good coffee leaned out and said they were ready to begin. Blair Chetworth Nance was already at the petitioner's table when I came in. She was arranging things, documents, a legal pad, a pen, a second pen. Organized. I will give her that. She looked up when I came through the door, and she looked at the chair next to me, or rather the absence of the chair next to me, the fact of my singular presence without a second briefcase, or a second suit, or a second person who would do the talking for me. She made a sound. A small sound, not a laugh exactly. Something shorter, something that lives in the register between amusement and satisfaction. The sound of a person who has just confirmed something she expected to be true. I put my bag down. I took out the folder. I opened it to tab 1, which is the procedural history and the response to petition, and I placed it on the table in front of me, and I smoothed the page flat with the back of my hand, the way I always do, and I did not look up. There was some procedural back and forth before the judge came in. The clerk called the docket. Things were confirmed. Someone checked a microphone. I sat and waited. I have waited in a lot of situations that were uncomfortable. I know how to sit still. Marcus used to say I was eerie when I was being patient. He meant it as a dig. I took it as information. Judge Rosario Almonte Pritchard came in at 9:07. She's been on the family court bench in Dunmore County for 14 years, which I knew because I looked her up. She is thorough and reportedly impatient with procedural sloppiness, which I noted and filed under good for me. She sat down, opened the case file, and looked at both tables in the way that judges do, the brief inventory of the room. Her eyes moved from Blair's table to mine and stayed there for maybe 2 seconds, noting the same thing Blair had noted. Single party. Pro se. She didn't make a sound about it. She just said, "Let's proceed," and looked back at the file. Blair gave her opening argument. She is a good attorney. I want to say that clearly because I am trying to be accurate, and the accurate thing is that she made a competent, well-organized argument. She used the word homemaker 3 times and non-working spouse twice. She used them the way some people use the word volunteer, technically true, slightly diminishing, designed to establish in the listener's mind that one party's contribution to the marriage was effective and domestic, and therefore, in the relevant calculus, of limited quantifiable value. The requested settlement reflected this calculus. I had the requested settlement numbers in front of me, under tab 2, and I had my response to them under tab 2A, and I had the basis for my response under tabs 3 through 7, and the entirety of the appendix. I had already heard every version of Blair's argument, not in the abstract, and not because I'd been through this before, but because when I was drafting my response, I researched the counter-arguments and wrote rebuttals to 4 of the most common approaches. Those rebuttals were in the appendix, pages 18 through 24, with citations. When Blair said non-working spouse, I turned to page 18 in my head the way you turn to a page you've read enough times that the act is automatic. I didn't write anything down. I just listened. My hands were flat on the table, and I was completely still, and if you had looked at me from across the room, you might have thought I was someone waiting for a bus. Someone present but not particularly invested in the destination. Judge Almonte Pritchard was reading while Blair talked, not ignoring her, nodding occasionally, making small notes, but reading, which meant she'd gotten to the portion of the docket that included my filing, because my filing was 46 pages plus the appendix, and it was not the kind of thing you skim. Or rather, it was the kind of thing that looked from the outside like it might be the kind of thing you could skim. That's important. I had not made it look impressive. I had made it look like what a careful but non-professional person might produce, thorough, slightly over-organized the way a person who has not practiced law is slightly over-organized. with a cover page that was correct but understated. I had formatted the appendix in the standard billing record style I had used for 3 years as a working paralegal, which is an unmistakable format if you know what you're looking at, and completely unremarkable if you don't. A checklist. A careful person's grocery binder, the tabs slightly too neat. The kind of document that a smart person might look at and think, she put in a lot of effort, bless her heart. Blair finished her argument. The judge was on page 6. I could tell by the way her hand was moving. She has a particular habit. I'd noticed it already from watching her in another hearing before mine that morning. I'd arrived early enough to observe, where she holds the page and rolls it slightly with her thumb as she reads, like she's checking that. There isn't a page stuck to the back of it. Thorough. Good. The judge asked me if I had any preliminary statement. I said yes. I gave the preliminary statement I had prepared, which was 3 paragraphs long, which I had memorized to the word because I do not read from a page when I'm speaking. If I can help it, it sounds like reading. And reading aloud sounds like you're not sure what you're about to say next. I was sure. I had been sure for months. I gave the statement, and I sat down, and Judge Almonte Pritchard went back to the file, and Blair made a small note on her legal pad, and Marcus, who I had not looked at and was not going to look at, shifted in his seat slightly. I could hear it. The chair legs on the tile floor. That specific small sound of a person adjusting their position because the position they were in had become, for some reason, less comfortable. The judge turned pages the way some people read quietly in a library, without urgency, without performing attention, just present with the thing in front of her. Page 7. Page 8. She paused at the bottom of page 8, which is where the appendix summary begins, where I described in one paragraph what the appendix contained, and then she turned to page 9. Page 9 is the first page of the appendix proper. It begins with a header in the format I learned in legal document preparation at Dunmore County Community College, matter description, date range, preparer, and then below that, in clean columns, date, task description, estimated hours, notes, November 2013 through October 2024, 132 months. Log to professional legal standards, in the format of billing paralegal uses, in a document that has been notarized annually since November 2014 by a retired deputy county clerk who keeps her own logbook and whose commission is current. Judge Almonte Pritchard stopped turning pages. She removed her glasses. She looked at the page for a moment, not reading anymore, just looking at it, the way you look at something when you've identified what it is and you're deciding what to do with that information. Then she looked up and across the courtroom at Blair Chetworth Nance, and she said, in the measured, uninflected way that I understand, is simply how she speaks and not a performance. Counselor. Are you familiar with the respondent's professional background? Blair looked up from her legal pad. Your Honor? Prior to the marriage. The judge set the file down flat on the bench and put her glasses on the cover, lens side up, the way you put glasses down when you're going to need them again in a moment, but not right this second. Prior to the marriage. And during. Blair looked at me. I was looking at Judge Almonte Pritchard. I did not look at Blair. Blair started, and then she stopped, and I heard. I am not editorializing this. I am reporting what my ears registered. The sound of something plastic hitting the floor. Small, light, rolling briefly. Her pen. She'd had it in her hand, and now she didn't. The pen rolled and came to rest somewhere behind her, and nobody picked it up, Blair said. I'd want to review the respondent's filing in more detail before. I'd like you to do that, the judge said. I'm going to call a recess. The clerk appeared at the side door. The judge stood. The clerk said, all rise, and we all stood, and the judge walked out and the door closed behind her, and then there was the particular kind of silence that fills a room after something has shifted in it. I looked down at my table. Tab 3, tab 4. The appendix sitting open to page 9. The columns of dates and tasks and hours stretching down the page in the same clean format I had learned and memorized and let lapse, and then, in the absence of anywhere else to put it, applied to my own life for 11 years. Communications management, calendar maintenance, financial record keeping, property oversight, dependent scheduling and care coordination, Legal document preparation, household. I use that exact phrase. Legal document preparation, because that is what it was. I heard Marcus's chair. I did not look. Blair said something to him in a low voice, and he said something back. And there was a pause, and then she said something again, and her voice had changed in a way that I noted without looking at her. The way a voice changes when the frame around a situation has shifted and the speaker is reorienting to the new frame. Marcus's voice when he responded had a quality to it that I recognized. Not anger. He does anger differently. This was the quality his voice gets when something has happened that he doesn't have a category for, when the expected pattern has not produced the expected outcome, and the gap between the expectation and the reality is requiring some kind of cognitive realignment. I had heard that voice before. The last time was when Caleb got a higher score on the SAT than Marcus had gotten on the SAT, which Marcus had not anticipated because Marcus still, on some level, thought of Caleb as a child who used to eat Play-Doh. I gathered my pages. I stacked them flush against the table edge, the way you stack pages when you want them to all be pointing in the same direction. I slid them back into the folder and pressed the cover down and checked that the tabs were flat. They were. They always are. And I clipped the folder shut. The folder makes a small sound when it closes. A clean plastic snap. The kind of sound a thing makes when it is exactly the right size for what it contains. I picked up my pen. My pen, the black one with the cap I've had since I started keeping the ledger, replaced the cartridge twice, kept in the front pocket of the gray canvas bag, because there is one right pocket for the pen and one right pocket for everything else. I stood up. I did not look at Marcus. There was nothing to see there that was going to help me. There was nothing to say to Blair Chetworth Nance that needed saying yet. Her time was coming, and it was going to come through the proper procedural channel, which is the only channel I have ever used, because it is the only one that produces a record. I picked up the bag. I walked to the courtroom door, the one that leads back to the hallway, and I pushed it open and let it close behind me. The hallway had the same wooden bench, same spot near the water fountain. I sat down. The same clerk with the good coffee walked past, glancing at me, and I nodded. She nodded back. The beige hallway walls, the overhead fluorescence with the one in the far corner that flickers slightly, which I had noticed in July and which had still not been fixed. The sound from somewhere further down of another hearing in progress, a man's voice raised slightly, then a door closing. I opened the canvas bag and took out the fresh legal pad. I always bring one. I never know when I'm going to need a fresh page, and I set it on my knee. The cover is a yellow cardboard that has a slight texture on the back that I find satisfying in the way that purely practical things can sometimes be satisfying. I uncapped the pen. I wrote the date at the top, month, day, year, same format I've always used. I drew a line underneath it the way I do, the habit from years of logging entries in the same format, the line that separates the date from whatever comes below it. Below it, I would write notes from the recess. What was said, what was asked, what I observed. Not for any particular future use. There might be more hearings, there might not be. The math in the appendix was already done, and done correctly, and it was not going to undo itself while I was sitting in the hallway. I wrote the notes because it is what I do after a thing happens. I write down what happened. Old habit. The pen moved across the yellow page, and the hallway was quiet enough that I could hear it, that small, clean scratch of ink on paper, and I wrote down the date and the line below it, and I kept going, because there was still more to write, and I had time, and I had always had time when I paid. Attention to where the time actually was, which is in the work, in the next correct thing, done correctly, and on time. Done. I closed the book on everything we'd been. Turns out the end was where I chose to begin.